It was a quiet evening at a small-town gas station, the kind of place where people nod politely and go about their business. Among the few customers was a reserved policewoman, casually filling up her car, blending into the background with her calm demeanor. But that peace was soon disrupted when a group of loud, rowdy bikers roared into the station, their laughter echoing through the air as they cracked jokes and drew attention. Spotting the officer, they decided to test their bravado, poking fun and throwing harmless taunts, assuming she was just another small-town cop. What they didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was that this seemingly unassuming woman had a past that demanded respect. A combat veteran with years of intense military training, she had faced challenges far more dangerous than their antics. She stayed quiet, assessing the situation, until one of the bikers took things a little too far. In that moment, her instincts kicked in and everything changed. The lead biker, a tall man with a leather vest and a cocky grin, stepped closer, making a snide comment about how small-town cops probably never see any real action. His friends laughed, egging him on. The officer didn't flinch. She calmly replaced the nozzle on the pump, her every movement measured and deliberate, as if she was deciding whether to engage or walk away. What none of them realized was that beneath her composed exterior lay years of battlefield experience. She wasn't just a police officer. She was a decorated combat veteran who had served in some of the toughest environments imaginable. Her training had taught her patience, discipline, and the importance of choosing her battles wisely. But as the group of bikers grew bolder, pushing closer and testing her boundaries, she started to assess them the same way she had assessed countless high-stakes situations in the past. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, from their body language to the tension in their movements. She wasn't afraid, but she was ready. As the group circled around her, their laughter grew louder, but their intentions became harder to read. One of the younger bikers, clearly trying to prove himself, leaned against her car, smirking. "What's the matter, officer? Cat got your tongue," he jeered. His friends chuckled, waiting for her to react. The officer stayed silent, her calm expression giving nothing away. Inside, her instincts were razor sharp. She was sizing them up, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far greater threats. She could tell these men weren't dangerous in the way she had seen in combat, but their bravado had a way of escalating situations, and she knew better than to underestimate anyone. Meanwhile, the gas station clerk watched nervously from behind the counter, unsure whether to intervene or call for help. The tension in the air was thick. The bikers thought they were in control, their taunts growing bolder, but they had no idea the quiet officer was simply waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. The leader of the bikers stepped even closer, his grin fading as he tried to read the officer's unreadable face. "What's the matter? You scared?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost taunting. His friends murmured behind him, watching intently. The officer met his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken, but her posture subtly shifted. She stood taller, more grounded, her sharp focus locking onto him. For a brief moment, the air seemed to hold still. The leader took another step forward, gesturing to his crew. "I thought cops were supposed to protect and serve. You don't seem like you're doing much of either," he said with a sneer, trying to provoke her. But instead of reacting, she took a slow step toward him, her hands steady at her sides. Her voice, low and steady, finally broke her silence. "You should be careful," she said, her tone carrying a weight that made even the loudest biker in the group quiet down. "You're walking into something you don't understand." The leader chuckled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his laugh. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in energy. The officer's presence now felt larger than life. her silence more intimidating than any words could have been. She was no longer the woman they thought they could toy with. She was someone they were starting to fear. The leader of the bikers opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The group turned their heads toward the road, momentarily distracted. "Looks like backup's coming," one of them muttered, trying to laugh it off, but the unease was clear. The officer didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the leader, who was now visibly irritated. "You call for friends?" he asked, trying to mask the hint of worry in his tone. But before she could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "She doesn't need backup." It came from an older man stepping out of a nearby car. He had a grizzled look and walked with a slight limp, but there was something commanding about him. The bikers turned to face him, confusion and curiosity replacing their bravado. "I seen what she can do," the man continued, looking straight at the officer with a knowing nod. "You boys are poking a bear, and you don't even know it." The leader's smirk faltered for the first time. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence starting to crack. The officer said nothing, letting the weight of the man's words hang in the air. The sirens grew louder, and now the bikers were unsure whether they were in control, or if they'd walked into something far bigger than they had anticipated. The leader of the bikers took a step back, his confidence wavering as the older man's words sank in. The sirens were closer now, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the gas station windows. "All right, we're done here," the leader muttered, trying to regain some control. "Let's go." But before they could retreat, the officer spoke again, her voice calm but commanding. "Leaving already? I thought you wanted to see what I could do." The challenge hung in the air, and the bikers froze, unsure if they should stay or cut their losses. Just then, the police cruiser pulled into the lot, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of more officers stepping out, the driver turned out to be an old friend of the officer, a fellow veteran who had heard about the commotion through the grapevine and decided to stop by. He gave her a knowing grin, leaning against his car. "Thought you might need some backup," he said with a wink. The bikers, now thoroughly unnerved, began to scatter, their earlier bravado completely gone. But as the leader turned to leave, the officer took one step closer. "One last thing," she said, her voice steady. "Next time you think about picking on someone quiet, remember, it's not the loud ones you should worry about." The leader nodded quickly, his confidence completely shattered. The group sped off into the night, leaving the gas station in silence once more. As the officer turned to the older man, he smiled. "You had it handled, didn't you?" She shrugged, a faint smile crossing her face. "Always do," she replied, the faintest hint of humor in her tone. The night ended as quietly as it had begun, but it was clear to everyone who had witnessed it. This wasn't just a quiet officer. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, the quiet gas station returned to its usual calm. The officer nodded her thanks to her friend, who lingered for a moment before heading back to his car. "You've still got that spark," he said with a grin, tipping his hat before driving away. The station clerk, who had been nervously watching from inside, stepped out hesitantly. "I didn't know you were, well, someone like that," he said, his voice a mix of awe and curiosity. The officer gave a small smile. "Most people don't," she replied simply, adjusting her uniform and walking back to her car. As she drove off into the night, she reflected on how moments like this always reminded her of one thing. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's steady. It's knowing who you are and what you're capable of without needing to prove it. The gas station lights flickered off one by one as the town settled into its usual stillness. But for those who had witnessed the night's events, It was a story they'd never forget.